Hello, I'm Rod Schaub and I work for Frontier Extension District. And welcome back. This is the third in the series of our electric fence videos. Today we're going to talk about the ground system. And you know, last time we talked about how the charger was the heart of the system. The ground system is the whole rest of the body, because if something's going to go wrong, it's probably going to go wrong in the ground system. I've had phone calls and guys saying, well, my electric fence system doesn't seem like it's hot. What's going on? And so one of the things I'll do is I'll ask them, how many ground rods do you have in? And I would guess 90% of the time, or 95% of the time, they'll tell me one ground rod. Well, in eastern Kansas, we get dry. And there are times of the year when one ground rod's not going to be adequate. You know, for the ground system to work, or the whole charging system to work, when that cow touches that electric fence, that energy goes through her body, through her feet, back through the ground, back to the ground system, and that's when it completes its cycle and that cow gets a shock, okay? But if we're really, really dry, not enough of that electricity oftentimes gets back to the ground system, and so we don't have a good performing electric fence system. So it's kind of a rule of thumb that you start with a minimum of 3 6-foot ground rods into the ground. Okay, so we want 3 6-foot rods all the way into the ground. Now, that's just kind of the place where we start. We typically want 3 foot of a ground rod per joule of output from our charger. So if you remember last time we talked about our chargers and the joules, 1 joule would power 1 mile of fence. Well, now what we're looking at is we're taking those same joules and we're saying we need 3 foot of ground rod to give that ground system enough ground rods to perform adequately. So if you look at this charger right here says it's a 24 joule output charger. So 24 times 3 is 72. If you're going to do 6-foot ground rods, that means you need 12. How many of you would have ever guessed that any ground system would need 12 ground rods? My guess is nobody out there thinks about having that many ground rods. Now, we want to also talk about ground rods. When you go out to purchase ground rods, we have 5/8 inch diameter ground rods and we have 1/2 inch ground rods. I would always suggest that we use 5/8 inch. It's just that much bigger in diameter. It's just that much more soil in contact with that ground rod, and it will actually, there's not enough difference in cost to warrant going to a 1/2 inch ground rod, okay? Now, we've talked about, in this case, we needed 12. We need to space those about 10 foot apart, okay? And preferably in a moist area. So if it's in a drip line of a building, or let's say maybe we don't have that as an option, so we go out and we put it right underneath the fence. That may be the next best option we can do, is put it right underneath the fence. That way we can get our whole 120 feet that we need for that ground system. Now, you can use copper or you can use galvanized, okay? But don't mix the metals. Anytime you would mix metal, you're gonna get corrosion. And when you get corrosion, then you'll also get poor conductivity of that electricity. So we definitely want to, if we're gonna use copper, we wanna use copper wire, copper rods, as well as copper clamps. If we're going to use galvanized wire, galvanized clamps, and galvanized rods. Now here I am, I'm kind of a penny pincher, so I like to use the galvanized. Galvanized is much cheaper. You know, copper wire is expensive. A copper ground rod is probably 3 times what a galvanized ground rod is. So from that standpoint, I like to use the galvanized. The other thing we want to think about is when we're placing our ground system in the ground, we got to keep them at least 65 feet away from any other ground field. So if you have a utility ground or a well casing, or you have another building here that has a ground system, we need to keep this about 65 feet from those other areas. And then lastly, when we put these in the ground, we want to leave about this much out of the ground, okay? We want the clamp and the wire and 4 or 5 inches out of the ground so we can find that ground system if something happens. One more thing, when you run your wire and you go from your charger, you're going out to your ground system. And so if this is coming out, we don't want to break the wire at each clamp. We want to run the wire through it and out and over to the next one, okay? We don't want to break it because that's just one more opportunity then for us to have problems with our grounding system. Next time we're going to talk a little bit more about the lightning protection ground system that we're going to use for our charger.